Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of the Scrimshaw Show. My name is Evan Scrimshaw. David Colletto has, for reasons passing understanding, agreed to come back on the Scrimshaw Show. David is the CEO of Abacus Data. He's one of Canada's finest, most premier pollsters in Canada. David, thanks for doing this.
It's great to be back, Evan. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I will have you on as frequently as I feel like I can get you to say yes. Since we last recorded, Christopher Freeland resigned. The Liberals went into a meltdown. Nobody would agree to be finance minister. They finally got Donald Long to be finance minister. Trudeau said he was going to take his time over the holidays. The Liberal caucus completely revolted. Trudeau prorogued Parliament. He resigned as Liberal leader. He is the interim PM. Donald Trump was going to impose tariffs and then has delayed it a little bit. But hey, those might still be coming this week. Doug Ford's about to call an Ontario election. Most of the Liberal contenders didn't end up running for the leadership. It seems like it's really Mark Carney v. Chrystia Freeland. I'll put Karina Gold in the top tier of contenders. The entire cabinet seems to have endorsed Mark Carney, or the vast majority of it. And the Liberals might be on the precipice of a true recovery of the likes of which there's little modern precedent. Your polling certainly has not suggested the massive swings of the Ecos and Main Street polls. What's the current state of your polling? I know that you released some details about a partial sample on Friday. Is the sort of 20-ish point lead that you were seeing on Friday, is that still what you saw through the weekend? Is there a new sort of preliminary estimate of what that national lead is going to be when you release your new poll? I think you said Wednesday or Thursday.
Well, first of all, yeah, like when you rehash everything that's happened in the last month and a bit, it's a reminder that we had a holiday somewhere in there. But yeah, so, I'm not seeing anything like what Main Street or Ecos has reported. We'll be out maybe later today as we're recording this in the Star with some numbers that are going to show a tightening of the race, but one that is more like what we were seeing before Chrystia Freeland resigned than anything different than we've seen in the last year, right? So we're seeing about a 20-point conservative lead, 18 points in Ontario, no substantial shift in how people feel about pretty much most of the metrics. There are some interesting shifts that are happening in terms of how people feel about Poilievre, how they feel about although less relevant today, Trudeau. Do they think the country's headed in the right direction? Those are the things that fundamentally have not changed in our polling, right? So I do not see any evidence that the complete, public opinion is completely reset and that the Liberals are actually competitive right now. Doesn't mean they can't get there at some point, but I do not see the shift that Frank or Keto have picked up.
So I think that's interesting that you're not seeing the big shift. Obviously, Main Street in an Ontario-only sample had the federal Liberals up. I think it was 1 or 2 last night. Frank Graves has the national race in the low single digits. I think there's a lot of interesting pollster mode stuff, which we'll get into in a couple minutes. But I think what a lot of people are conflating, and I think some of this is willfully conflating because people would like it to be true, or a lot of Liberals at least would like it to be true, is something being plausible and something being correct, right? It's certainly plausible that getting rid of Justin Trudeau, putting in a new leader, and especially putting in the vacuum of a new leader where everyone can sort of believe the Liberals will pick their preferred choice of leader or type of leader. It's certainly plausible that could produce a big shift. But that's not guaranteed that it's going to produce a big shift. And I think it's interesting to me that the Liberals are still stuck at sort of 20-ish in your polling, because that is notable. just because you're not getting a huge sort of like new leader bump, but it is also, I think, notable that you have that lead at 18, you know, in Ontario, because that's where a lot of the movement seems to have been. Both Keto and Frank Graves had sort of, essentially tide races in Ontario. You're not seeing that big swing. You said you're doing an oversample in Ontario. Am I allowed to ask whether or not that's because you're going to be releasing a provincial vote intention poll at the same time?
Yes. I don't know what time you're going to put this out on Monday, but check the Toronto Star also for some new Ontario numbers as well, which don't match the Main Street numbers that I think were released either early this morning or late last night.
Yeah, no, that's going to be very interesting. But what do you make of the sort of like? Do you think people are just rushing to believe numbers that they want to be true? Because that's kind of my belief about this. And frankly, I'm saying this, and I don't need you to comment on this, but like the idea that it's really that we're already back to like a, call it 5 or less point race, like that doesn't seem plausible to me with the whole the Liberals are in.
But it doesn't, right? And here's my, and I go through the same exercise, right? Because there are times in the last 20 years that I've been doing this that I get a poll and I'm like, whoa, that is not what I expected. That's a big change, right? What could have happened? I'll give you an example. We've seen almost a complete flip in how people feel about the Ford government in Ontario compared to our last poll in early December. I think given everything that's happened around him and his role that he's played, I think it is plausible that more people in Ontario now feel that they approve of the Ford government than they did previously, 5-6 points. That's a reasonable swing given what has happened in my mind. But when I look at the fundamentals that the Liberal Party of Canada, regardless of whether Justin Trudeau is part of the leadership team or not, was facing was these things, right? One, they barely won the last 2 federal elections. So they got about a third of the vote both times and have been unable in those elections, particularly in 2021, when the circumstances should have, and it appeared to benefit them when that election started, given you had a pandemic, given you had, a fairly successful, I would say, and the public's thought that until that election started, navigating the country through that crisis. And they still only landed with 32-33% of the vote in that election. So that is, at least we should think, is kind of the kind of not the floor for the Liberals, but a natural kind of place for them. And that's all before everything that we've measured every 2 weeks since then, which is inflation has taken a huge bite of the public's kind of sense of optimism, right? Only a quarter of Canadians, less than that, think the country's headed in the right direction. That number has not budged. It's returned again to the place we saw it before Chrystia Freeland resigned. She kind of knocked that number down 4 points in resigning. But when I try to make sense of what is plausible, is this kind of shift that the others are seeing plausible? I still come to the conclusion that in my mind it's not, because while Donald Trump has become president, people knew he was going to be president for 2 months. And yes, maybe some of the things he's actually done in the first few days of his administration are shocking, and the speed and scale of what he's done is shocking. It isn't like people woke up and said, well, wow, that's not what I thought Donald Trump would do, because he's been telling us what he would do for a long time. And the Canadians that have been paying attention, which is most of them, would have already known that. So to think that all of these events, even the Liberal leadership race, Evan, like even today in the polling that we're going to release later this week, there's still a sizable number of people who don't know who Mark Carney or even Chrystia Freeland is. So to say that they're even imagining that these two people could be, and I don't put Karina Gould in there because I don't think she has a shot of winning. If either of these two people might win the leadership, that all of a sudden the public's like, oh yeah, well now I'm open to voting Liberal again. What I would believe is plausible is that the number of those open to voting Liberal would increase, and it has, by about 4 points. What I do believe is plausible is that the frustration and the anger and the whatever towards Trudeau will dissipate over time the longer that announcement, and then finally by the time so to me it when I look at all of those factors and I look at where the state of public opinion is more broadly, and the fact that people's views in our polling towards Poilievre have not changed, I cannot get to a conclusion that says, well, the Liberals have seen a 10-point swing in their support and the Conservative vote is down 10 points in the course of a month.
Yeah, especially at a time when the Liberals haven't really been focused on an anti-Poilievre sort of message, particularly, but they've been mostly fighting amongst themselves.
And one more thing on this. Like, I've tried to go back and find, have there been instances where we've seen in a very short period of time a big swing like this? And they happen sometimes in election campaigns when the public is paying attention. I don't believe it's plausible to believe that over the course of the last few weeks, even as people are paying attention to what's going on in the US, and maybe some of them paying attention to the Liberal leadership race, that 6-7 million Canadians woke up and said, "Oh, I'm changing my mind today." And I don't find that. I expect there to be a slower shift, if there is one, over time.
Yeah. So I, not to bring this into the pollster wonk territory. Obviously, you are an online panel pollster. EKOS and Main Street are IVR or text to an online survey, but it functions like an IVR in terms of selection for Main Street. You guys, like, we have seen in 2021, if you just looked at your polling in the 2021 campaign, you would not have seen the sort of huge swings in that race that we saw from Main Street, EKOS, and Nanos in the daily trackers. Obviously, the counterpoint to that would be, yeah, but when it came to BC Conservative, when the BC Conservative surge happened, it was the panel pollsters that were lagging. What do you make of the sort of panel v IVR debate? Obviously, I've written about it a couple times. My general position is that there are reasons to be skeptical of huge surges that are seen in IVR polling, because it can be mere statistical noise. It's more likely to be statistical noise than big movements in an online poll. I've written about it. I wrote about it on Saturday. Do you have any you read about it when you released your last poll? Do you have any more takes? Is there any sort of hot take that you didn't put in writing, or do you think this is?
No, I think what I shared on my post is how I feel about it, right? And I don't use it as often as Frank or Keto or others in terms of really knowing its nuances. And so, but I teach a class on polling at Carleton, and we dig into different modes, right? Online, live interview, telephone, IVR, and there are certainly mode effects. I think it is absolutely clear that online does vary less on average than other modes, particularly random sampled IVR, which I think is the most volatile version of it, right? And that's why when others during the 2021 election, which you use as an example, were saying there's this runaway O'Toole freight train headed towards victory, I wasn't seeing it. And so when I think of it, then what's the plausible explanation, right? And there's not a lot of academic research on this. I went and I looked. There's some that one study that looked at multiple countries using different modes suggested that online is less effective at picking up a swing, but didn't provide, I don't think, any evidence to back up that claim in that article, in that journal article. So my hypothesis is that IVR, for example, which has a very low response rate, is measuring something slightly different when most of the electorate isn't fully engaged in something, and it is picking up enthusiasm. It's the same reason that Frank and Keto and Forum Research suggested that the People's Party were going to get 9-10% of the vote in the last federal election. It's because those voters were more engaged, more interested in letting their voice be heard in a poll. So when an automated pollster calls them, not only are they more likely to maybe pick up, maybe that doesn't increase the likelihood, but they're definitely more likely to answer the survey. And you don't get registered as a respondent unless you complete that survey. Whereas an online poll doesn't have the same incentive to complete around enthusiasm because everybody gets an incentive, actual like money or points to complete that online survey. So that helps, I think, eliminate the bias that comes with enthusiasm. And so, again, I'm just going to reiterate my argument, which is if you think about everything you just described at the beginning of our conversation, Evan, right? The environment that has fundamentally changed. I do believe that liberal-oriented Canadians are more motivated and excited and interested in politics now that the Prime Minister has announced his resignation, now that there's a liberal leadership race going on, and now that Donald Trump is president. It has activated those kind of voters who may now be more likely to be answering surveys, but I don't believe the number of them has fundamentally changed.
I agree with that, and I think the fact that I wrote a column, not this past week, but the week before, whose headline was "Remember what hope felt like," feels like, I think, probably says a lot about the mood of liberal-oriented Canadians. And yeah, no, like there is like a little, like there is a sense of optimism. There is a sense of like, maybe we actually can do this. And I think that is probably what the IVR pollsters are picking up in a, to a more extreme effect. Do you think, how do I ask this in a way that's not going to get you in deep trouble? Do you subjectively think Pierre Poilievre is running a particularly good operation these days? Because this is kind of one of the takes that I'm thinking about a lot, is Poilievre doesn't really seem to know what he's running against, and I think the loss of Trudeau for them is a problem. But like, you've got Jenny Byrne accusing Nate Erskine-Smith of sort of manhandling, being a creep towards Mills Lanceman. You've got Poilievre sending out letters with the wrong date, asking Mark Carney whether he's going to fire every Trudeau minister. Jenny Byrne decided to get into a Twitter war with Aaron O'Toole a few weeks back. Like, the Conservatives feel like, I think the other reason that people sort of believe that the Conservatives could blow this, and I don't necessarily mean blow it and actually lose the election, but they could see a small majority as opposed to the landslides that, your polls certainly would suggest they're on track for, is that it doesn't feel like their operation is running particularly efficiently right now. And it feels like once the Liberals get a new leader, Poilievre could be weak, especially if that new leader can raise some money and get on TV fairly quickly. Is that, do you sort of buy that subjectively? You pay attention to this, you're seeing his favorables. Like, do you think there's a weakness in his favorables that could, if the Liberals can get on message and if Poilievre doesn't get, back into gear well, like, do you think that's possible?
Yeah, look, I think it's possible. And I don't know at all what is happening within the leader's office or within the party. But, if I think about, I love sports, and I think about the importance of psychology to sports performance. It's not just about how good you are, it's how good your mind is. That I have no doubt that the last few weeks have completely thrown the Conservatives off what they thought was a very clear trajectory and a simple and clear argument for why change was needed. That is not the case anymore. I'm going to write something later this week about the importance of framing this election and how voters view the frame, right? Trump has, and I wrote about this actually on my Substack, like I do think Poilievre has a Trump problem, right? That a third of his supporters right now, a third of those who like Pierre Poilievre do not like Donald Trump, but 40% like Donald Trump and like him a lot. So how do you navigate an environment where your coalition, which I've argued previously was really built around a desire for change, an agreement that they dislike Justin Trudeau, but not much else, right? Other than maybe the cost of living is a real pain point and change is something that people want to see. But beyond that, this new Conservative coalition, has strong disagreements on some pretty important things. And so I think that, again, as simply by observing, I think it may have thrown them off a little bit, right? And so their opponent has changed. They're not sure which one it is. And we've seen that happen before to the Conservatives At the end of 2023, we saw kind of like a dip in their polling that I think was because they got off message and they started focusing on things that the voters didn't want them to focus on. So I think the fundamental question for the Conservatives is, if more and more Canadians want their political leaders and the options that they're considering to be offering up, how do you deal with the effect of Trump? They've got to have an answer. And I think Poilievre did okay on that in his interview with CTV Atlantic, but I think all this other stuff has distracted perhaps them and us to, I think, increasingly what that choice that voters want to see happen. So yeah, I don't think they're on their best game right now, but I do know, again, something I've highlighted as someone who studied campaign finance in my previous life as a fake academic, is that they're still sitting on a ton of money that they are going to point, their guns at. Right, they're already doing it now. They're not even waiting to find out who the Liberal leader is going to be. That gives them a massive advantage still to dominate the agenda.
Yeah, I think part of the case for optimism for the Liberals is that Carney will presumably be a better fundraiser than Justin Trudeau, than this version of Justin Trudeau, who is, who a lot of even Liberal voters were mostly sick of, especially given Carney's, Goldman friends. I think Bastert's going to be more willing to break out the checkbooks.
I think the other challenge, though, and I don't know this, but I don't believe this to be the case, that I don't think the Liberal Party has done the sufficient work to figure out through research how to actually litigate the case against Pierre Poilievre. I don't think they know. I don't know if I know what that is, because I haven't done extensive work on it. But if these two camps who are likely to become leader are not also spending a lot of time and effort, that's the challenge with the time frame they're under, is that they've got to not only win this leadership, but they've got to figure out what is the argument, not just for us to get reelected, but to undermine and to challenge the credibility of Pierre Poilievre as an alternative to be prime minister.
I think we do know that calling him a wannabe, Trumpian figure and a threat to a woman's right to choose was not an effective argument. Which, spoiler alert, calling Pierre Poilievre went on I think it was the English language CBC leaders debate, and unabashedly referred to himself as pro-choice. He went to La Presse when he was going to run for his, eventually short-lived 2020 leadership campaign, and said that, voting against gay marriage is, one of his great mistakes in life, and that's been a huge success. I have not particularly understood what the Liberal message under Trudeau against Poilievre was, when you can just paint him as a bad conservative, who isn't going to spend money, who's going to cut programs. That seems to be a far more effective sort of argument against him, especially given even, majorities of conservative voters don't actually want Poilievre to cut a lot of the program, like the breakfast program, childcare, dental care.
Not at all.
Conservative voters don't want that, so it feels like that would be the effective attack line.
That and I also think there's a wedge sitting there that if that could be coming if Trump puts in tariffs and they're as devastating as he suggested they might be. Are we going to be debating how much we have to spend to backstop the Canadian economy? Is this going to be another debate about how we protect Canadians? Because in that argument, Poilievre has been critical about how much the government spent during the pandemic. If you've got a Carney versus Poilievre offering up two different versions of how we protect people at a time when they're feeling already so vulnerable, to me, that's an interesting debate that I don't know how the public falls down on, especially if Freeland, frankly, who helped navigate the country through the first pandemic financially. Whether you think it ended up in the right way or not, a crisis can reset people's frame. And so that's why I think, by doubling down and going overwhelmingly on I'm going to balance the budget, I'm going to, cut every dollar, $1 for every new dollar that I spend, has Poilievre left any room for him to be able to maneuver out of that? I don't know if that's going to be needed, but it's certainly, I see that coming as a potential wedge, one in which Doug Ford's not afraid to go into because he's already said I might need to spend tens of billions of dollars. So we'll see. But I do see, again, more opportunities for Liberals to reframe the conversation away from who's going to make your life more affordable to who's going to protect your standard of living when Trump's trying to blow it all up to part.
Yeah, and whether or not, and how negative against Trump Poilievre can be given his divided coalition on the Trump issue is notable. Why is Jagmeet Singh's polling completely collapsing since Trudeau resigned? Like, what? I mean, I know part of me assumes, and I know the answer, which is just that nobody has particular fondness for Jagmeet Singh, and a lot of his vote was just disaffected Liberals parking it there. But like, a lot of these pollsters have had the NDP down in, we're flirting, 15, 14. I think Main Street had the NDP, 12% in Ontario. Obviously, you don't necessarily agree that the Liberals are as high in some of the IVR pollsters, but like, are you similarly seeing the NDP in a real crisis position, or do you think that's also just an IVR? But that's not necessarily just been an IVR thing so far. What do you make of Jagmeet Singh? Do you think the NDP are going to regret not having gotten rid of him?
I do think there's an IVR effect on that, because I don't think New Democrats, if you're a New Democrat inclined supporter right now or voter, there's not much to be excited about right now. And that's a problem for New Democrats, right? That's a real problem in terms of motivating voters and getting them out. We have them holding fairly steady. But I think you raise a good point about Jagmeet's personal numbers, right? I think what's happened over time is that, he was one of the few political leaders, at least prior to Poilievre, that found goodwill, even if people never intended to vote for him, across the political spectrum, right? That especially during the confidence supply arrangement, Liberals generally liked him. Before then, Conservatives had turned them all off. And so all he's really left with is his own party supporters who say, I like Jagmeet Singh. There's a little residual left over among current Liberal supporters who say, he's okay. But Conservatives really don't like him. And Democrats generally do, but that's about it. So he's basically been left with an audience. Like, he wasn't polarizing before, and now he is. So, there's a strong correlation between your vote and how you feel about the leaders. And because he's got such a small base, it's hurt his overall numbers. But I also think that I don't know what the New Democrat relevance is today. I don't know what he's arguing that's different. And I think that's going to be a big, big problem. If the choice it shifts from who do you think is best to deliver change to who do you think is best to protect me from Donald Trump. And the NDP is getting squeezed out of the first one because Poilievre is winning that argument. And I think they can get deeply squeezed from the second as the Liberals try to counter the Conservative approach to Trump.
Especially given a lot of the best, or at least most well-known New Democrats, Carol Hughes, Charlie Angus, Rachel Blaney.
Not running, yeah.
Like that caucus is going to be decimated. So even if you think what an NDP sort of cabinet would look like in some fantasy land where they won the next election, like, we actually don't, because plenty of people.
You raise a really interesting point about those MPs, right, and the ridings they represent, which I think are part of this, which we had seen and still exists today, this cultural shift in these working, I'm going to call them this, it's too simplistic, but these working class, private sector unionized, think Sault Ste. Marie, think Sudbury, think Windsor, kind of ridings where the Conservatives have made gains over time. It's not just a Poilievre effect, but I think Poilievre has just put them in a place where they're likely to win most of these seats from the New Democrats. I just thought of something do voters in those kinds of ridings react differently or get animated to a debate around how to protect their jobs and manufacturing and resources and the like in an environment where Donald Trump is saying, I don't need what you make anymore. I don't know if it helps the New Democrats, but it should, and it gives them an opportunity to try to differentiate themselves as the Liberals from what the Conservatives might do to protect those kinds of jobs. It moves away from, you don't get me as a person because you're culturally different, to you understand my. And I think that's how progressives speak to those voters in an environment like this, where they wouldn't have had that opportunity, I think, prior to Trump, really going full in on the tariffs and the disruption that he's causing.
You just literally stole my transition, and that was going to be where I was going next. So I appreciate the mind meld of that one. But do we really think that Singh's NDP can be the party that can go back to Sault Ste. Marie, can go to Thunder Bay, can go to Timmins, can go to Skeena, can go to Campbell River, and go to manufacturing, and you can go to sort of fishing and lumber and these sorts of pulp and paper mills and places like that. What about Singh's NDP tells us that he can be that guy?
I don't.
That's the thing, is that Andrew Horwath tried it provincially in Ontario, but the problem with the NDP, and I know that you know this point because one, you see it in your polling too, and B, you have been a reader of mine for long enough that I'm sure you've read this rant about 4,000 times, but the NDP are fundamentally two political parties stuck together by first past the post. And when Andrew Horwath went on TV and talked about how unvaccinated teachers have charter rights too, and the Ontario Liberals need to stand up for those union workers and their charter rights, and then got cyber bullied into changing her position within a day from the urban Torontonian, socially progressive wing of the party. Singh is absolutely a product of that socially liberal, socially progressive wing, and I just don't see how he could ever be the guy who's going to go to Timmins and save the seat formerly known as Charlie Angus's, right?
I agree. And, I did that segmentation a few weeks back, right, where I broke out the electorate into these different segments, and there was one, and I didn't use any fancy interesting names behind them. I just simply said, there's this quarter of the electorate that are progressively economically progressive but socially conservative. And when I say socially conservative, I mean it's not just that they're not anti-abortion per se. They're more resistant to immigration. They don't love the speed at which things are changing around them, right? And they can be activated on those issues. Jagmeet Singh cannot speak to that group, right? But that is the group right now that live in those exact ridings that you described, right? And would happily have voted for an Ed Broadbent, would have found common cause with a John Horgan in British Columbia. Even a Bob Rae, in the 1990s, even though he's very academically inclined, could his populist streak could speak to them, right? Even Jack Layton, I think, did in some ways. But you're right. I think the NDP's problem is that, the Liberals, when people talk about the Liberals moving left, the Liberals moved left fundamentally on the cultural side of that, right? And so that side is the largest segment outside of this mixed group that I described, but they're still fighting over only about a quarter of the voters, and leaving basically exposed a similar sized group on the cultural right that still want government intervention, want businesses taken to a task, believe they're getting ripped off by corporate Canada, but also don't want to see immigration ramped up, and also feel that some of the cultural stuff has been just too fast. Change has happened too fast on that front. So I don't know what the NDP does in that environment, but they have certainly. I think the way you describe it is exactly right. They're two parties combined in one. In some ways, as are the Liberals, but for different reasons. The Liberals are they believe, entirely socially liberal, but you've got this economic conservative part to it that it believes is the dominant strain of Canadian politics when in fact it's just a tiny minority of the public.
Yeah, for sure. That segmentation exercise is a great factoid for the residual Chrétienites in the party who genuinely think that it's still 1997. Quickly, I just have two more questions before I get you out of here. One, what is happening in Quebec? Why is the liberal vote hemorrhaging so much? And why? Because that was one of the places where the liberal vote was holding up slightly better in the sort of like before the last like 3 months. Now it's really down to like 20 in basically every poll, and even the IVR pollsters aren't seeing a huge increase in Quebec. Yeah. What do you make there? I mean, the Liberals are now definitively in third, and Poilievre is flirting with like the mid to high 20s. Like, what are you seeing in Quebec? Do you know what's happening in Quebec, or do you think this is just like, genuinely, I don't have an answer and I can't guess at one, and I'm wondering if you have an educated guess or something.
Well, I think, here you actually raise a really good point about IVR versus online. We're saying the same thing about Quebec. So why? And what is happening in Quebec that's different than might be happening in Ontario with Liberals? And I think in Quebec, Justin Trudeau's resignation actually has the opposite effect that it has elsewhere, because it was still the one place that he still had residual support and goodwill. And so if you're a Liberal in Quebec and you see Pierre Poilievre coming on and likely to form a majority government, and you see somebody who was so tied to your province and the party having zero Quebecers, well, I shouldn't say zero, but Francophone Quebecers stepping up to try to lead it, is a strong signal, I think, that there's nothing to be excited about if you're a Quebec Liberal with the federal party right now. And so I actually think we've landed on perhaps why IVR, again, another evidence point to say, why is IVR picking up something else elsewhere but not in Quebec, is because those Liberals in Quebec actually aren't as enthusiastic about it, right? They are deeply worried. Quebecers are much more likely to say that their vote in the next election is going to be about who can protect them from Donald Trump than the rest of the country. But I don't think they find any affinity in any of the national parties, and so the bloc becomes, again, that safe harbor. I always say, though, I admit to not being able to fully understand Quebec because of my language limitations and not being able to consume French language media. But to me, that sounds like a plausible hypothesis about why the Liberals have dropped there. That Trudeau, that was the one part of the country where I think people said, if Trudeau leaves, I'm less likely to vote Liberal now. And there's your effect. And it was one of the reasons why Trudeau supporters said he should stay, was because he still had Quebec, at least to some extent, in his support column.
Yeah, that case was harder to make after LaSalle, but
yes,
it's just really funny that one of the questions I asked you when we recorded the podcast, we recorded it December 9th, so literally 1 week before Freeland, before Freeland resigned, was, would the Liberal Party have been in a better place if Trudeau had listened to me and resigned after Toronto St. Paul's? And like, it just was so funny watching that, and then like a week after I asked that question, it's, oh yeah, the government are at like 19% and are down like 26 points. It was hilarious. Last question: do you think Doug Ford is going to face like a serious penalty for calling an early election? And do you think that this could be 1990 redux, or do you think that a lot of the people invoking 1990 are just sort of relying on a crutch to try and make this election more interesting in Ontario?
Yeah, I think there's always a possibility. I hate making firm predictions about anything, because you never know what catches people's attention and how they focus on it. But when I look at the polling I'm seeing, I do not believe we are likely to see that kind of outcome. I think we're more likely to see what happened in Nova Scotia, but for different reasons, which is, we may talk about the early election for a few days, but in a media cycle where Donald Trump, and if he brings tariffs in on February 1st, we will not be talking about that anymore. It will be over. I don't think we're going to see a scenario where we spent a week and a half talking about why Justin Trudeau called an early election in 2021, when there was really nothing else to talk about, frankly, because the pandemic was still kind of on, right? But there's so much else that we're going to be focused on that will concern us, that I think will likely get over the price tag. They will likely get over the political, the political dimension of calling this earlier election. And I think very quickly we'll come to trying to figure out what choice they need to make. So I think the only other wild card I always say, and I saw it with Andrea Horwath in 2018, was when people don't know the political leaders very well, a campaign is their moment to shine. And I think Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie, to a lesser extent, but still to some extent, are not well known in this province. And they have an opportunity in those first few days and in a debate, if people are paying attention, to shine. But if they don't, and if the public doesn't think they're the option they're looking for, well, then I think Doug Ford is likely headed to as easy a re-election as he faced in 2022 this time around.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am on it. I think the other thing that a lot of progressives miss about Ontario is like the Ontario election will not, like federal elections just have a certain baseline of attention and turnout because of that attention, because a federal election is the first 3 blocks on CTV National News and on the National. It is the front page of the Star, the Post, the Globe, and the Sun papers most days of the campaign. An Ontario election just doesn't necessarily get that. That might, it might be 10:30 before we get to Doug Ford, or 10:20 before we get to Doug Ford. And that just doesn't provide progressives with that same level of sort of like, people who generally are sort of meh on Doug Ford, who don't love the other options. They're not necessarily likely to turn out in the same way that, Trudeau has been able to run anti-conservative campaigns the last 2 times federally and still get a third of the vote, just because, progressives who don't love him, but who didn't love Scheer or didn't love O'Toole came out to vote for him. I'm worried as an Ontario progressive. I wouldn't be super thrilled about the prospects of this election, but it's here, so let's.
Well, and here's the other thing that I think an election in Nova Scotia teaches us is that, like, in order to beat Doug Ford, there has to be a consolidation among progressive voters. And when I look at second choice in the vote right now, 14% of those who would vote Liberal, Bonnie Crombie's Liberal Party, would put Doug Ford as their second choice. Only 38% picked the NDP. And New Democrats are far as likely to say the Greens are their second choice than the Liberals. So unless there is a instigator that causes that like rush to the anybody but Ford kind of movement, which I don't see right now because his approval rating's pretty good for an incumbent in the environment that we're in, that's got to change in an election in which, to your point, this is probably the second and third, maybe fourth story on a newscast that half the province won't even be watching.
Yeah, like that's really where I am. Also, You should publish those second choice numbers just so I have another data point to smash all we need to do is merge the parties together and we'll win forever, people. Because I always like data that'll ask me to bash those people's heads in. David Coletto, CEO of Abacus Data. Read his polling when it's in the Toronto Star. His Substack is David Coletto, abacusdata.com. You post some articles there in addition to your polling. Thank you so much for coming on the Scrimshaw Show, buddy.
Thanks, Evan. Have a great one.
Have a great one.